Your visor is fogging over. Your heart rate has tripled. Inside your gloves, your fingers feel like they belong to someone else, stiff and unresponsive no matter how hard you flex them. Somewhere behind you, a spacecraft is the only pressurized object within 100 miles, and you can no longer see the hatch that leads back inside it. This is not a nightmare. This is the afternoon of June 5th, 1966, and you are astronaut Gene Cernan, floating at the rear of a Gemini capsule with sweat freezing into ice on the inside of your faceplate. For most people, a spacewalk sounds like floating. Graceful, quiet. A man drifting past a window with the Earth turning slowly beneath him. That image is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Behind almost every photograph of an astronaut calmly working outside a spacecraft sits a suit fighting its own internal physics, a cooling system pushed to its limit, and a human body working harder than it would, running a hard sprint back on Earth. Let's start where the danger actually began, not with the vacuum of space, but with a suit that nobody had truly tested outside a laboratory. On March 18, 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to leave a spacecraft. He climbed out of an inflatable airlock attached to Voskhod 2 and floated free above Earth for just over 12 minutes. According to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, his Birkett suit had been built and tested on the ground where Earth's atmospheric pressure pushes back against any pressurized fabric. In orbit, with no air outside to balance the pressure inside his suit, the fabric ballooned. It stiffened around his limbs until bending his arms and knees took everything he had. Leonov could not fit back through the airlock the way mission planners had designed. He had to vent pressure from his own suit, bleeding off oxygen through a valve, just to regain enough flexibility to climb back inside. His body temperature climbed sharply during the struggle, and by his own later account, he felt as though he were standing in a pool of his own sweat by the time the hatch sealed. The exertion of fighting a suit that would not bend pushed his body harder than the spacewalk itself ever could have on its own, a pattern that would repeat for almost every astronaut who followed him outside a spacecraft over the next 2 decades. Declassified mission reports surfaced decades later, examined by space historian Anatoly Zak, and reported by the Smithsonian, painted a version calmer than the dramatic memoir Leonov wrote years afterward. But even the calm version describes a man whose own suit had nearly trapped him outside his spacecraft. 11 weeks later, on June 3, 1965, NASA sent astronaut Ed White out of Gemini 4 for America's first spacewalk. His outing looked almost effortless by comparison. 20 minutes, a handheld maneuvering gun, no demanding task, beyond drifting and testing how a human body handled itself in vacuum. It went well enough that engineers at NASA believed they had already solved the hardest problems a spacewalk could present. They had not. They had barely asked the real question. A year later, Gene Cernan went outside Gemini 9A with a far harder assignment climb to the rear of the spacecraft and strap into an Air Force jetpack called the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit. According to NASA's own mission history and accounts from the National Air and Space Museum, Cernan fought his umbilical tether the entire way back because every motion he made sent the cord pulling him in the opposite direction, a textbook case of Newton's third law, turning a simple climb into a wrestling match. By the time he reached the AMU, his suit's air cooling system could no longer keep pace with his exertion. His visor fogged from the inside, then froze when his orbit carried him into Earth's shadow. Picture that for a moment. You are alone outside a metal capsule traveling 17,500 miles an hour. You cannot see more than a few inches in front of your own face. The only window you have left is a small clear patch you rub open with the tip of your nose pressed against the inside of your own helmet. Mission control. Watching Cernan's heart rate climb past 155 beats per minute and then keep rising, made a call. Flight surgeon Charles Berry and Commander Tom Stafford decided the jetpack test had become too risky to continue. Cernan dragged himself back toward the hatch, mostly by feel. His suit, fully pressurized and stiff as cardboard, made even bending his knees to sit down feel like fighting his own body. By the time the hatch finally sealed, 2 hours and 7 minutes after he had opened it, Cernan had lost roughly 13 pounds. Much of it water weight sweated straight into the lining of his suit. He later called it the spacewalk from hell. Here is the twist most people miss. The danger nobody had fully anticipated was not radiation. It was not a torn suit losing pressure in vacuum. It was something almost mundane, a human body generating heat faster than a life support backpack could remove it. Engineers had designed suits to keep astronauts warm in the cold of space. Almost nobody had designed for a man working hard enough to overheat inside his own protective layer, in an environment with no air to carry that heat away through ordinary convection. Sweat had nowhere to evaporate. It simply pooled against the skin, soaked into the suit's inner liners, and fogged a visor from the inside out exactly when an astronaut needed clear vision most. NASA took the lesson seriously. After Gemini 9A mission planners added handholds and foot restraints to spacecraft exteriors, giving astronauts something to brace against instead of fighting their own momentum with every push. Training shifted toward neutral buoyancy pools underwater simulations that mimic weightlessness far longer and more realistically than the brief weightless arcs available on a parabolic aircraft flight. Suit engineers reworked the cooling system entirely, building on early water-cooled flight suits developed for Royal Air Force pilots and demonstrated to NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center back in 1964. Hamilton Standard, working with NASA contractor ILC Industries, turned that earlier groundwork into a full liquid cooling garment, a layer of nylon and spandex threaded with fine plastic tubing worn directly against the skin, with water from a backpack life support unit circulating through it to carry heat away continuously, rather than depending on air alone. The garment became standard equipment on the Apollo A7L suit, debuting on Apollo 7 in 1968, barely 2 years after Cernan's visor had frozen over outside Gemini 9A. By the time Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface in July 1969, into daytime temperatures that could climb past 250 degrees Fahrenheit, that same circulating water system, not the suit's outer insulation alone, was what kept them from cooking inside their own protective layer. A version of that liquid cooling garment is still worn inside the suits used on spacewalks from the International Space Station today, 18 years after Cernan's ordeal on February 7, 1984. Astronaut Bruce McCandless stepped out of the Space Shuttle Challenger wearing a suit shaped by everything those earlier missions had taught NASA. He climbed into the Manned Maneuvering Unit, a self-contained backpack with its own propulsion, and pushed away from the shuttle entirely untethered, farther from a spacecraft than any human being had floated before. The photograph from that moment, a lone figure against pure black with Earth curving far below, became one of the most reproduced space images ever taken. What the photograph does not show is the work behind it. Better cooling, better restraints, better training, decades of small corrections paid for by Cernan's exhaustion and Leonov's ballooned suit. None of that quiet engineering shows up in a still frame. It is only visible in how calm McCandless looks compared to how Cernan had looked nearly 2 decades earlier. 8 months later, on October 11, 1984, astronaut Catherine Sullivan became the first American woman to perform a spacewalk working alongside fellow astronaut David Leestma in Challenger's payload bay to demonstrate that a satellite could be refueled in orbit. Before launch, reporters had openly asked her commander whether they believed Sullivan possessed the physical strength for the job, a question rooted directly in how brutal earlier spacewalks like Cernan's had proven to be. Sullivan answered for herself at the pre-flight press conference, rather than letting anyone else speak on her behalf. The mission ran 3.5 hours shorter and calmer than Cernan's ordeal nearly 2 decades earlier. Evidence of exactly how far suit design and training had come since that overheated half-blind struggle outside Gemini 9A. So let's reconstruct what a spacewalk actually asks of the human body today, step by step. Days or even weeks before launch, astronauts rehearse the same tasks underwater in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, a pool large enough to submerge a full-scale mock-up of a space station module. Because water resistance comes closest to mimicking the weightless drag of working in vacuum. Hours before an astronaut even opens a hatch, they breathe pure oxygen at lowered pressure inside the airlock, purging nitrogen from their bloodstream to avoid decompression sickness. The same physiological risk a scuba diver faces surfacing too quickly. Once outside, every motion costs more energy than it would on Earth. Because a pressurized glove resists bending at each joint, and there is no solid ground to push against, only handholds bolted to the spacecraft and the astronaut's own core strength. Heart rates climb. Breathing quickens. The cooling garment runs constantly against the skin, and astronauts flying today still describe a 6 or 7 hour spacewalk as some of the most physically demanding hours of an entire career in orbit. Even with all of that progress, a spacewalk has never become routine in any ordinary sense. NASA's own assembly records show that astronauts and cosmonauts spent more than 1,500 combined hours working outside the International Space Station during its construction and upkeep. And to this day, the agency runs a camp-out procedure before most spacewalks, having crew members sleep overnight inside the airlock at lowered air pressure to purge nitrogen more thoroughly and reduce the risk of decompression sickness once outside. That single procedural change traces directly back to the early improvised pre-breathing protocols Soviet and American engineers cobbled together before anyone fully understood how a human body would behave in vacuum. On March 11, 2001, astronauts Susan Helms and James Voss spent 8 hours and 56 minutes outside the station, a record that stood for over 2 decades, precisely because suit life support systems were never designed to run much longer than that without astronauts edging into the same exhaustion and overheating risk that nearly ended Cernan's mission. Engineers built more capable suits. They did not eliminate the underlying limit. They simply pushed it further out. Why does any of this matter to someone who will never leave Earth's atmosphere? Because the liquid cooling technology built to save Gene Cernan from heat stroke now shows up far from orbit. Versions of it appear in cooling vests worn by people living with multiple sclerosis, a condition that makes the body especially sensitive to overheating in protective gear. Worn by wildland firefighters working near active flames for hours at a stretch, and in the suits sealed cockpit race car drivers wear inside cars that can climb past 130 degrees Fahrenheit during a race. None of those applications involve vacuum or orbital velocity. All of them rely on the same basic insight Hamilton Standard and ILC engineers reached after watching Cernan nearly cook inside his own suit. A body working hard needs help removing heat and circulating liquid. Does that job far better than circulating air ever could. The handholds and foot restraints engineers added after Gemini 9A shaped how every spacecraft and space station exterior has been designed since right down to the handrails astronauts still use today, moving across the outside of the International Space Station. A fix built to save one exhausted astronaut struggling to reach a hatch eventually became standard infrastructure for an orbiting laboratory the size of a football field. The lesson has not gone away simply because suits improved. On July 16, 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano was working outside the International Space Station with NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy when he felt cold water collecting at the back of his head inside his helmet. According to NASA's own mission history, the water kept accumulating, eventually covering his eyes, ears, and part of his nose, until ground controllers terminated the spacewalk and Parmitano made his way back to the airlock, largely from memory unable to see or hear clearly. Investigators later traced the leak to contamination, clogging a fan pump inside his suit's life support backpack, not to any failure of the vacuum outside. NASA's Mishap Investigation Board called Parmitano's calm under those conditions a likely factor in his own survival. Almost half a century after Cernan's fogged visor and Leonov's ballooned suit, the same basic truth held the suit itself, not the empty space surrounding it, remained the most dangerous part of the job. Spacewalks did not become survivable because someone built a stronger suit. They became survivable because engineers paid close attention to one of the body's most ordinary limitations. It generates heat, and in a vacuum, that heat has almost nowhere to go on its own. Vacuum sounds dramatic. Radiation sounds dramatic. Sweat pooling inside a glove does not. It nearly ended a mission anyway, and it quietly rewrote how every spacewalk since has been planned, trained for, and engineered. Your visor is clear now. Your heart rate has settled. Inside your gloves, your fingers move the way they are supposed to move, bending at each knuckle without a fight. Behind you, the hatch is sealed, and inside the lesson your suit just taught, an entire space program is already being written down for the next person who has to step outside.